Hi, welcome to our series on Culture Builders. This is a podcast that explores leaders that win through people's success. And I'm here with my partner, Christian Nielson, and we're the ones who sort of love this stuff, and that's why this is our podcast. We're going to take a bit of a change of pace here. The last several leaders that we have discussed have been big personalities, interesting industries. Some of them are revolutionary in the way they do things. Today, we're going to look at a quiet leader, Mary Barra, who is the CEO of General Motors. She has a different style, and she inherited a completely different organization. You were talking about this as we got ready for this podcast, that, what did you call it, cultural mass?
Yeah, we've talked about a lot of founders, and that's one interesting challenge, to build something from the ground up, infuse it with your personality and passion, and really shape things and make adjustments along the way. But starting from one person to two people to grow to where it's thousands of employees reinforcing a culture is one thing. With Mary, she is leading a very large and established, over 100-year-old culture, and a very, what I would say, industry influenced culture as well. The automaker industry informs and reinforces itself as well. So a different challenge. We did talk about, we had a session on Alan Mullally at Ford, and I think there's some similarities there, but there's also differences. Alan was brought in from outside. Mary, as I think we're going to explore, very much built her career within GM. And so it's a really interesting case study to explore what she's doing and kind of the challenges she's facing.
Yeah, so let me just give our listeners a quick overview of Mary's bio. She's finished descent, and she is not only a lifer herself at General Motors, but her father worked for 39 years at the Pontiac factory in Detroit. So we have this second generation commitment to General Motors. She graduated from what's known as GMI, or General Motors Institute. It's now called Kettering University, with a BS in electrical engineering. But what's interesting is that was a program that's called the West Point of automotive learning, or automotive industry. And it was a technical school that offered these bachelors in trades and in sciences associated with the automotive industry. And so that's where she got started. And she had an internship at age 18 checking the fenders and hood panels on General Motors products. So she was out on the line living and breathing this stuff as she studied it. She later went back in the early 90s and went to Stanford and completed a master's in business administration as, a way to prepare for other aspects of leading an organization. And then she's had a lot of different roles at General Motors, including head of HR, which we don't often see that a CEO has been the head of HR, but she was the head of HR and then also the head of global product development. And then in 2014 became the CEO.
Yeah, we don't see that very often. We work with a lot of CEOs, and not many of them had any time in HR. So I personally love that there's that, at least some part of her preparation was employee focused that way. And also, I don't envy just the challenges of working with the complications and the factors involved with unions and manufacturing, and the complexity of HR in that world is pretty astounding.
For sure. And it leads us to a story that I wanted to highlight. Was just, she was given the opportunity, I think, while running HR, to change the dress code. And the dress code went from 10 pages to a single 2-word statement, dress appropriately. And this is her quote about that. It really became a window into the change that we needed to make at General Motors. I can trust you with $10 million of budget and supervising 20 people, but I can't trust you to dress appropriately. It was kind of a step in empowering. So this has really encouraged people to step up. What a change, and really an interesting way to approach something as simple as a dress code.
Yeah, there's the beauty in just the increased flexibility, but the symbolic show of trust and autonomy is, I think, really powerful in a culture, especially if it's, that might seem like a minor thing for some of us outside of that space, or, certainly if you're coming from a tech background, of course, why would you even have a dress code to that extent? But in that world where it's so, it was probably deeply ingrained in the culture and the expectation, and completely felt normal to them, even if they didn't love it, to have that kind of breath of fresh air was probably very welcome.
What I also appreciate about it is the confidence it puts in leaders. We sometimes want to take leadership off the shoulders of our employees, and because we're like, well, we'll define appropriate 10 ways till the sun comes down, and we'll make sure we've thought through every possibility. But it's okay for a leader to say, this is what's appropriate. This is what we mean. This matters to our clients for these reasons. And what's appropriate in marketing may not be appropriate for someone who's working with, service representatives at dealers.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree completely. And I also I think this little dress code example is great because, a lot of times with these large established organizations, they move towards entropy, or they become these heavily legislated or regulated or self-regulated bureaucracies, and we have a rule and a policy for everything. The longer they exist, the more they kind of trend to try to kind of regulate or kind of mandate every little step of that. And it really minimizes the employee and minimizes leaders. And so giving some autonomy and trust back, I think, goes a long way, especially an organization that's existed for so long.
Another story that was highlighted about her was she's known for a bit of frankness, just sort of telling things like it is. And when she was head of product development, she had a simple directive: no more crappy cars. And then she went on to say that sometimes we put so many boundaries on our employees that we don't give them a recipe for success. So now we're saying no excuses. If it's a budget, if it's resources, if we have to do great cars, trucks, and crossovers, it's our job to enable you to do that. It's interesting that when you empower your employees, then you really take on the responsibility of getting rid of roadblocks for them and empowering them. So it's not just go make this happen, here's a mandate from on high. But when she said no more crappy cars, she realized it came with, and I've got to help you have the tools and resources you need to make that possible.
Yeah, and I think the full tagline on that quote is no more crappy cars except the new Blazer. No, I will stop this from being a car critique, but I will say that the Corvette makes up for the Blazer.
The challenge, and we're having to keep ourselves in check, is the two of us are gearheads and very much, have strong opinions about certain General Motors products, which we're absolutely in love with them, and particularly if they were made in 1970. But anyway, we'll have to keep that out of the commentary. You have developed something around here, Christian, a concept that you teach our clients and that you've taught me, and it's called Wride for the Brand. And I'll let you talk about it, and then I want to show how I think Mary exhibits this tendency to ride for the brand.
Yeah, it comes from kind of a combination of just the observational experience with organizations measuring and working with strengthening the employee experience, and also a lot of the data we capture. We recognize that one of the best things a manager can do for engagement for their team isn't necessarily to say, hey, we're a great, strong team, and I'm going to make sure you have training and tools and all those things. Those are important, but the things that really makes a difference in terms of engagement is connecting them back to the organization. And so what I mean by that is it's one thing for me to get my team to be loyal to me and favorably about me and our immediate team experience. It's a much better thing for me to connect them back to the large organization. We're doing something bigger than just functioning in our immediate team efforts. We're supporting a larger effort. We're part of something more meaningful. And we kind of associate that with the concept that comes from cowboys. They're not just doing a job. They're not just working for a ranch. They represent the brand, or as ranches are represented by the brand for their livestock. They're kind of associating their work with something larger than themselves. And we see that time and time again, driving a more meaningful experience for the employees, higher engagement, and better outcomes for the organization. And we see that in Mary's approach. There's a lot of really great stories and quotes where you can kind of read between the lines that she's connecting people back to serving the customer. She's connecting people back to the larger effort, not just the job, not just the brand or the sub brand. It's the bigger story. And I think you and I both agree that is a very positive thing to see in her approach.
Yeah, we were chatting about this as we were preparing for the podcast about two things that she said. She always tried to keep the company's interests and not her own the focus of her attention. And then this quote that you take every assignment as if you would be doing that for the rest of your life. And what I thought was interesting about that is that's not just, okay, have some sort of stoic philosophy. I'm just going to accept where I'm at. What I think that means is you then conceptualize, how do I make this the very best thing possible? How do I squeeze every last bit of value out of what I do? If I'm here forever, how is this going to be the greatest thing I can make it?
Well, and I think that in contrast to the other leaders that we've highlighted in this podcast, it really goes, look at her tenure with the organization. She's very capable. She's got a Stanford MBA. She could have probably jumped ship, 24 times to other organizations throughout, but she stayed with GM. So she herself is a living symbol of kind of being connected to the brand. And also, I mean, kudos to those that selected her for this role for recognizing that within their own organization, not having to bring an outside voice. And also, in terms of her being a pioneer, the first female leading one of the big three, all those wonderful things as well. So some really interesting things to consider when you study Mary in her current role.
As I mentioned when we started the podcast, that she was different than the other personalities we've highlighted. I think she challenges some assumptions we have about culture, and let's talk about those. One is outsiders are better than insiders. There's a lot of reason to value institutional knowledge. And just because someone's had an experience elsewhere doesn't always make them immediately qualified to come in and run something as technical as General Motors, right? I mean, she's an engineer after all. That's her fundamental training. And you can't just bring in someone from, a startup, a social media startup, and think that they're going to have the necessary skill to run a behemoth like General Motors.
I think that's a great point. One of the biggest challenges I see a lot of folks coming in from outside of the organization and wanting to make change is they miss a critical step in understanding and even honoring the current state or the past. You can hurt a lot of feelings by coming in and saying, you're doing this all wrong, versus someone that's lived it with them and then saying, we need to make some adjustments. It's a different tone and it's a different voice for change.
I think she challenges the assumption that big personalities are better than quiet leaders. She was difficult in the sense that she doesn't have a lot out there. And so we found these really precious nuggets and stitched together the profile. But you can be a quiet leader and very effective. Yeah. And then just one last point, that just because you stay in one place, that doesn't mean you can't adapt and grow. She's held numerous positions. She served as head of HR, as we said, and head of development. That growth doesn't mean jumping around. You don't have to look outside always in your career. And I think part of that comes from the fact that she was committed to General Motors' interests. And so when she was making the decision between should I stay or should I go, if she ever probably had a few opportunities, she was going to look out for General Motors because she was riding for that brand.
Yeah.
You shared with me a quote you liked, and while you fish that out, I just wanted to just cover a few highlights. She's invested billions in electric vehicles, and we're excited to see that those come to fruition. She's announced the Hummer truck lineup, was quick to address the COVID issue by helping Ventec Life Systems make ventilators. And GM, under her leadership, has consistently scored high in gender equity reports. In 2018, it was one of only 2 global businesses that had no gender pay gap. So pretty impressive. And that's I think, a legacy to her HR position, and I think to being a woman.
Yeah, that quote I found, and I could pull a few that I really have enjoyed reading and thinking about. One is just as very simply, if we win the hearts and minds of employees, we're going to have a better business success, which is very simple and straightforward and very true, and not always something that's on the top of mind for a CEO. So, I'm sure she's kind of learned that lesson several times throughout her tenure, but that HR lens, however long she wore that hat, I think certainly informs that. So I think some very interesting perspective coming in. And I'm like you, there's not a lot out there. She's not necessarily, we're not reading as many books and things about her outside, and maybe they're there and we just haven't bumped into them yet. But I'm excited to learn more about Mary and to follow her career and the choice she's making and see if she can convince me to buy some GM vehicles.
Well, we need to redo the Blazer to make that happen. One thing I just want to finish from my perspective, I wanted to share with our listeners, was she's a grown-up. And what I mean by that is you think of sometimes these startups like Uber, and they have these challenges, and there's allegations of workplace, funniness going on. she's always been sort of a grown-up, and I appreciate that. And it just shows that there's a room for that just being wild. Like, I kind of think of the WeWork scenario, and nothing is as far from, is it Newman and his culture than the culture of Mary Barra, and I think she wants it that way.
Agreed.
Well, thanks, Christian. Thanks to our listeners for joining us for this episode of our Culture Builders podcast. If you have leaders you'd like us to recognize or honor or just study, please send us that at info@decisionwise.com. And we ask you to bookmark us and continue to listen to us as we try to explore how different leaders use culture to drive business success.